The sun rose over the historic palace, casting a golden glow on its towering spires and ancient walls. The palace stood as a symbol of the city's rich heritage, drawing thousands of tourists from all over the world each day. Among the attractions, the royal guards were a favorite, stoic, disciplined, and always standing at attention, no matter the situation. James, a young guard in his mid-20s, was stationed at the palace gates that morning. With his polished uniform, gleaming boots, and unflinching posture, he embodied the honor and pride of his role. James had always dreamed of becoming a royal guard, following in the footsteps of his grandfather. To him, it wasn't just a job. It was a duty to protect the legacy of his country. Tourists crowded the square in front of the palace, snapping photos and trying to capture the perfect shot with the guards. Some made silly faces, others waved frantically, hoping to get a reaction. James, like all the guards, was trained to ignore the distractions. His face remained calm, his eyes focused straight ahead, even as a young child tried to tickle his arm with a feather. But today wasn't going to be just another ordinary day for James. In the crowd, a group of tourists stood out. They were loud and energetic, joking among themselves as they observed James. Two men and a woman, all in their early 20s, seemed particularly amused by his serious demeanor. "He's like a statue." One of them laughed. "Do you think he's even real?" The woman grinned. "Let's test him. Maybe we can get him to move." James overheard their chatter, but didn't react. He had dealt with many such visitors before. Some tried to make him laugh, others waved objects in his face, and a few even attempted to provoke him. But James was proud of his discipline. Nothing could break his composure. The group began to circle James, taking exaggerated selfies and making exaggerated faces. Other tourists nearby started to watch, curious about what they were doing. "Maybe he's a robot," one of the men joked loudly. The others laughed, egging each other on. The square grew noisier as more people noticed the scene. Some smiled in amusement, while others looked uneasy. James remained still, his training taking over, even as his stomach churned with unease. This was starting to feel different from the usual antics. Then one of the men pulled out a scarf. "Let's make it fun," he said with a mischievous grin. His companions cheered him on as he approached James with the scarf, clearly intending to take things further. James's grip on his ceremonial staff tightened slightly, but he didn't move. His duty was to remain calm and professional, no matter the provocation. Yet, deep down, he knew this day was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would soon become the talk of the entire city. The square buzzed with energy as the group of tourists grew bolder. Encouraged by the laughter of onlookers, they seemed determined to test the limits of James's patience. The man holding the scarf waved it dramatically, as if he were about to perform some kind of magic trick. His friends laughed, their phones ready to capture every moment. "Let's see if he's really as tough as he looks," the man said with a grin. He stepped closer to James, holding the scarf up as though it were a harmless prop. James stood tall and unflinching, his face betraying no emotion. The man began to wrap the scarf around James's arm, acting like it was all a joke. "Come on, Mr. Guard, you're part of the show, aren't you?" he teased. James didn't respond. His training was clear. No matter what happened, he was not to engage unless there was a clear threat to safety. The other two tourists joined in, giggling as they tied the scarf into a loose knot. "Look at him. He's like a mannequin," one of them said, snapping a selfie with James in the background. Some of the nearby tourists began to feel uneasy. An elderly couple whispered to each other, and a mother pulled her child away from the growing commotion. Not everyone found the situation funny. A shopkeeper from across the square, an older man named Arthur, noticed what was happening and frowned. Arthur had worked in the square for decades and had great respect for the royal guards. He stepped outside his small souvenir shop and called out to the group, "Hey, leave him alone. That's not how you treat someone doing their job," Arthur said firmly. The tourists glanced at him, but their laughter didn't stop. "Relax, "Old man, we're just having a bit of fun." One of them replied dismissively. Arthur shook his head, his voice growing louder. "This isn't fun. You're crossing a line." But the group ignored him. They pulled out another scarf and began to tie James's other arm to the nearby pole. The crowd around them grew, some laughing nervously, others recording the incident on their phones. James, bound by his duty, remained silent and motionless, though inside, he felt a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. He knew he couldn't react, but he also understood that the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. The woman in the group grinned as she adjusted the knot. "There we go. Now you're part of the decoration," she joked. Arthur clenched his fists, his voice sharp and commanding now. "You've gone too far. Someone needs to call the palace security." One of the tourists laughed nervously. "What are they going to do? It's just a joke." But Arthur wasn't joking. He stepped back into his shop and discreetly pressed a button under the counter, a direct alert to palace security. Unbeknownst to the tourists, help was already on the way. The group of tourists continued to laugh and joke, oblivious to the growing tension in the square. James remained still, his hands tightly bound to the pole with scarves, his posture as perfect as ever. To the crowd, it was an unusual sight, one that they found both strange and amusing. But what seemed like harmless fun to the tourists was starting to feel wrong to some of the onlookers. A few people in the crowd exchanged uneasy glances. They whispered to each other, their eyes flicking between James and the rowdy tourists. The elderly couple who had earlier watched the scene were now shaking their heads in disappointment. A young girl, perhaps no older than 10, tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed at James. "Why isn't he moving, Mommy?" she asked, puzzled. The mother frowned, not sure how to explain. "He's a guard, dear. They stand still, but they shouldn't be treated like that," she said quietly, pulling her child away from the commotion. Arthur, the shopkeeper, stood off to the side, watching the tourists and feeling more and more frustrated. His patience was running thin. The tourists weren't taking his warning seriously, and they seemed to be enjoying themselves without realizing the disrespect they were showing. One of the men in the group raised his phone to take a video, stepping closer to James. "Look at him. He's like a statue," he said, the words dripping with amusement. The others crowded around, taking their turns posing with the stoic guard in the background. They continued tying him up, adding more scarves, and making comments about how funny it was that he hadn't even flinched. "Come on, man, give us a smile. You're part of the show now," the woman said, snapping another picture. She laughed, but there was something in her voice that hinted at a lack of understanding. She didn't realize that James wasn't just a performer. He was a person, and this was his duty. It wasn't a game. James's mind raced, but his training kept him grounded. He couldn't break character. He couldn't react to their actions, no matter how uncomfortable he felt. But inside, he was furious. He could feel his heart pounding, his patience stretched to its limits. How had things gone this far? How had these tourists, with no understanding of his role, crossed the line without even realizing it? The crowd had started to grow, and the noise level was rising. Some were still laughing, but others seemed uncomfortable. James could hear a few people muttering things like, "This isn't right," or "Shouldn't someone stop them?" But no one spoke up. It felt as though the prank was becoming a spectacle, something to be watched rather than stopped. Just as the situation seemed to be escalating, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the square. At first, no one noticed, caught up in the laughter and chaos. But then the air changed. It became heavy, charged with an unfamiliar energy. A group of royal guards appeared in the distance, their uniforms sharp and polished, their presence commanding attention. The tourists hadn't noticed yet, but the tide was about to turn. As the royal guards entered the square, their heavy boots echoed sharply against the cobblestones. The tourists, still laughing and taking photos, didn't notice at first. They were too caught up in their own world of jokes and selfies. But the sudden change in atmosphere couldn't go unnoticed for long. The air around the square seemed to shift. Some of the onlookers, who had been silently watching the scene, noticed the royal guards marching forward with purpose. The crowd fell silent, and the noise that had once filled the square began to quieten, replaced by the weight of tension that hung in the air. Arthur, the elderly shopkeeper, watched the guards approach with a mix of relief and caution. He had always respected the royal guards, knowing they were more than just ceremonial figures. They represented the history, strength, and pride of the city. He had seen many tourists come and go, but never had he seen anyone push the boundaries like this group had. The tourists were still caught up in their fun. One of the men was adjusting his phone for another selfie, while the woman added another scarf to James's restraints, chuckling at how real it all looked. But the moment the guard stepped into view, the mood of the square began to change. The leader of the guards, a tall man with a commanding presence, locked eyes with the tourists. He didn't need to say a word. The stern look on his face was enough to make the group fall silent. The man holding the phone froze, mid-click, and his smile slowly faded as he realized that the situation was about to get serious. The leader of the Royal Guard, Commander Harris, stepped forward, his boots clicking sharply against the stone pavement. His voice, clear and firm, cut through the remaining laughter of the tourists. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his tone leaving no room for mischief. His words were calm, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. The tourists shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of the gravity of the situation. The woman looked nervously at the others, her grin fading. We were just having fun. We didn't mean any harm," she stammered. "Fun," Commander Harris repeated, his eyes never leaving the group. "What you're doing isn't fun. It's disrespectful to the Royal Guard and to the city. You've crossed a line." The tourists, now realizing the seriousness of the situation, began to back away. The man who had been tying James's scarves loosened them, his hands trembling. "We're really sorry," he muttered, his earlier confidence gone. Arthur stepped forward, his face serious but relieved. "This isn't a joke. You don't understand the responsibility these men carry. They stand here to protect the traditions of the kingdom." The woman quickly apologized, still looking nervous. "We didn't know. We thought it was all part of the fun." James, still tied to the pole, could feel the tension ease as the guards surrounded him. Though he remained motionless, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. It was over. Help had arrived. Commander Harris addressed the group one last time. "I suggest you leave now before this becomes more serious. We will not tolerate disrespect toward the Royal Guard again." With their heads down, the tourists scrambled to untie James completely, their faces flushed with embarrassment. The crowd around them was watching, some shaking their heads in disapproval, while others simply stood quietly, as if relieved that the situation was finally being handled. As the tourists left the square, the Royal Guard stood tall, ensuring the square returned to its peaceful state. The square that had once been filled with laughter now felt calm again. The Royal Guard had not only protected their reputation, but had also taught a valuable lesson that would not be forgotten anytime soon. The square had grown eerily quiet after the Royal Guards had arrived. The tourists, now regretful and embarrassed, had quickly unbound James and scurried off, their faces red with shame. The crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle began to slowly disperse, their curiosity satisfied. But for James, the events of the past few minutes had left an impression that wouldn't fade quickly. He stood there for a moment, his hands still sore from being tied, but his face as calm and professional as ever. He could feel the weight of the situation lifting as the Royal Guards, now surrounding him, made sure the square was back in order. Still, his mind replayed what had just happened. He had stayed strong, following his training, but that didn't mean it hadn't shaken him. The moment of calm was short-lived, though. James heard the faint hum of a communication device from one of the guards nearby. Commander Harris, the leader of the Royal Guards, held up his hand, signaling for silence. "It's done," he said in a low voice, but the seriousness in his tone made it clear that something had just shifted. James's heart raced slightly as he stood taller, hoping that he hadn't missed anything important. The guard who had been communicating with the outside world stepped forward. "Commander," he said, his voice filled with urgency, "Palace security has been alerted. They've confirmed that the incident has been recorded by surveillance cameras." The guard paused for a moment, glancing at James. "And the footage is already being reviewed. Authorities are involved." James's stomach tightened. He hadn't realized the seriousness of the situation when it first began. The tourists hadn't known it either, but what had started as a harmless prank had quickly escalated. They hadn't known that palace security was always watching, always on guard, keeping the royal traditions safe. James turned his attention to the crowd that had been gathered. Some of them were still standing near the edges of the square, watching in curiosity, while others had already walked off. But one thing was clear. This incident had become far more significant than a few laughing tourists messing with a royal guard. It had drawn attention, and now everyone would remember it. Commander Harris, standing tall and unwavering, addressed his team. "We need to make sure we respond with professionalism. They may not understand the full consequences, but we'll show them that this is not something to take lightly." He turned to James. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer than before. James nodded. He could feel the tension easing in his chest, but the sting of being humiliated in front of a crowd still lingered. "I'm fine, Commander," he replied, his voice steady despite the emotions stirring within him. The royal guards began to secure the area, checking in with the nearby security teams. It was clear now that their presence was more than just a deterrent. It was a promise. The guards were there not just to protect the palace, but to uphold the dignity of the kingdom, no matter what. As James stood among his fellow guards, he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Though the prank had caught him off guard, he had learned something important that day. He had been tested, and he had come through. And now he could take pride in the fact that he had upheld his duty, even in the most challenging of circumstances. The day had been difficult, but James knew one thing for sure. Help was always just a moment away, and the royal guard would always be ready to respond. The tourists had retreated quickly, their earlier bravado replaced by a nervous energy that seemed to follow them as they left the square. The crowd, which had been buzzing with excitement just moments before, began to disperse slowly. People returned to their shopping, chatting with friends, and taking in the sights, but the ripple of what had just happened lingered in the air, like an unspoken question that everyone was too polite to ask. For James, the sense of calm that had returned to the square didn't last long. While he stood there, still recovering from the ordeal, he couldn't help but feel a new sense of appreciation for the presence of his fellow royal guards. Though he hadn't been able to react as he might have wanted, knowing that help was on the way had made all the difference. As he looked around, he caught the eyes of Commander Harris, who was talking to a few of the other guards. Their conversation was brief but serious. James could sense the undercurrent of authority that ran through Commander Harris's voice. This wasn't just a small incident anymore. It had drawn the attention of higher authorities. Palace security, after all, was always watching, always ready. The royal guard's presence was about to make its full impact. James could already hear the sounds of boots marching from down the street. The unmistakable rhythm of footsteps grew louder, and a powerful sense of discipline filled the air as more royal guards approached, their uniforms sharp and perfectly arranged. Within moments, the squad was in full view. It wasn't just a small team. It was a show of force, a group of 10 guards, each one walking in perfect formation, their boots clicking loudly as they marched in unison. The crowd, still lingering in the square, instinctively fell silent. There was something undeniably commanding about the way the squad moved. Their presence was more than just about power. It was about upholding order, ensuring that the traditions and respect for the royal guard were not diminished, no matter what. James stood straighter as he saw the squad approaching. He recognized a few faces in the team. other guards who had been with him in training. Each one had an air of professionalism about them, their posture just as perfect as his own, their eyes scanning the area with sharp focus. It was clear that they were here to ensure that the situation didn't escalate further. Commander Harris took a step forward as the squad gathered around him. Without saying a word, the squad's captain, another officer James recognized from training, nodded in his direction. The communication between them was seamless, unspoken but understood. The captain's eyes scanned the scene, pausing to look at James, who stood silently by the pole where he had been tied just moments before. The captain addressed the group of tourists who had been involved in the prank. "You're lucky we were able to handle this calmly," he said in a low but firm voice. "But we don't tolerate this behavior. Not here. Not in our city." His words were a warning, clear but measured. There was no anger in his tone, just a quiet strength that made everyone around him listen. The tourists, who had now gathered nervously in a small huddle, lowered their heads, realizing the gravity of the situation. James felt a small sense of pride swelling within him as he watched the squad's composed yet powerful presence. They were here to protect the traditions of the Royal Guard, and they were ready to respond to any challenge, no matter how small or large it seemed. As the last of the tourists left the square, their heads hung in shame. The Royal Guards remained vigilant. The square was once again peaceful, but the lesson had been learned. The Royal Guard had made their point, and it was one that would echo through the city for a long time. The square, once filled with laughter and chaos, now stood in a heavy silence. The tourists who had caused the disturbance had quietly walked away, their heads low in embarrassment. The Royal Guard stood tall, their stern faces and disciplined posture a stark contrast to the earlier playful atmosphere. Commander Harris, who had led the response, remained calm and collected, his eyes scanning the area as if nothing had happened. James, though still shaken by the events, stood at attention, his hands now free from the scarves that had bound them. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation slowly lift from his shoulders. The square had returned to its usual state of calm, but he knew that the events of today would not easily be forgotten. "Commander," one of the guards said, stepping forward, "we've received confirmation from Palace Security. The footage is being reviewed, and authorities are aware of the incident. The tourists are being followed, and their actions are being documented." Commander Harris nodded, his expression still serious. "Good. Let's make sure this is handled properly. We can't allow this kind of disrespect to go unnoticed." James couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. He had known, deep down, that help was on the way. But now, seeing that the situation was being taken seriously by the palace security and the authorities, he realized how much more was at stake. This wasn't just about a harmless prank. It was about upholding the dignity of the Royal Guard and the traditions they represented. The group of tourists had no idea what they had truly done. They had thought it was just a joke, a way to have a laugh at the expense of a stoic guard. But in doing so, they had disrespected the very traditions that had been built over centuries. The Royal Guard was not there for amusement. They were a symbol of the kingdom's strength, history, and honor. As the Royal Guard stood in formation, their heads held high, James felt a quiet sense of pride. This wasn't just about the uniforms or the training. It was about what they represented. The Royal Guard was a part of the kingdom's identity, and today they had proven that they would always stand strong, no matter the challenge. Commander Harris turned to James, his expression softening slightly. "You handled yourself well today," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "You did exactly what you were trained to do." James nodded, feeling a flush of gratitude. He had remained calm, even when everything around him was spiraling out of control. It hadn't been easy, but he had stayed true to his duty. And in the end, it had paid off. As the last of the tourists left the square, their faces filled with regret, the Royal Guards took their positions once again. The square was peaceful once more, but James knew that the day's events had left a lasting impression on everyone who had witnessed them. The royal guard had shown the world that they would not be disrespected, and that they would always be there to protect the traditions of the kingdom. The silence in the square deepened as the royal guards resumed their watch, standing tall and unwavering. James stood alongside them, feeling the weight of their shared responsibility. Though the day had been difficult, he knew that they had done what was right. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a soft light over the palace, he felt a renewed sense of pride in his role. The royal guards continued their watch over the square, standing still and unyielding, as though nothing had happened. The tourists, having learned their lesson the hard way, had left the area, their heads down in regret. The usual buzz of the square had returned, but there was an undeniable shift in the air. The event had been a reminder of the strength and importance of the royal guard, and how their role was far from just ceremonial. James stood among his fellow guards, his back straight and his posture impeccable, but his mind was far from calm. The earlier incident replayed in his thoughts. How had it gotten so out of hand? Why had those tourists thought it was funny to disrespect someone doing their job? He had always believed in the importance of discipline and duty, but now, standing in the quiet square, he realized how quickly things could spiral out of control. Still, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had stood firm, despite everything. He had done his job, and in doing so, he had helped maintain the dignity of the royal guard. It was moments like this that reminded him why he had chosen this path in the first place. It wasn't about the uniform or the attention. It was about protecting the traditions of the kingdom and ensuring that the honor of the royal guard was never tarnished. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the square, James noticed a few people lingering, watching the royal guards with newfound respect. The tourists may have caused trouble, but in the end, it had been the royal guard who had restored order. Their presence had reminded everyone of the importance of respect and the strength of the traditions they upheld. Arthur, the elderly shopkeeper, who had witnessed the whole ordeal, walked up to James with a smile. "You handled yourself well today," he said, his voice warm and genuine. "Not many people could have kept their cool like you did." James smiled back, feeling a sense of gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I just did what I had to do." Arthur nodded. "I've seen many things in my time here, but I've never seen anyone stand so firm under pressure. You've earned your place among the royal guard, young man." James felt a surge of pride at Arthur's words. It wasn't often that he received praise, especially from someone who had seen so much. "Thank you," he replied quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. As the evening wore on, the square gradually grew quieter. The tourists who had been causing trouble were long gone, and the only sounds now were the soft rustling of the trees in the breeze and the distant hum of the city. The royal guards remained in their positions, their eyes scanning the square with unwavering focus. They had done their duty, and now there was nothing left but to reflect on the events of the day. James looked around at his fellow guards, each one standing tall and proud, their faces calm but resolute. He realized that it wasn't just the uniform that made them strong. It was the shared commitment to their duty, to protecting the traditions of their kingdom, no matter what. And as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, James knew that he had done his part. The royal guard had been tested, and they had come through, stronger than ever. The square was finally quiet. The last few tourists had wandered off, leaving the royal guard standing tall as always, like silent sentinels keeping watch over the kingdom's history and traditions. The sun had set, and the soft glow of streetlights began to light up the cobblestones, adding to the peaceful atmosphere of the evening. James stood in his usual position, still processing everything that had happened. The chaos of the afternoon felt far away now, as if it belonged to another time. He glanced at the other royal guards around him, their faces calm and composed, just like his own. They had all stood strong together, and that was what mattered. Together, they had upheld the dignity of their role, no matter how difficult the situation had become. But even though the square was calm again, James knew this event wouldn't be forgotten. The tourists who had caused the disturbance would certainly remember the Royal Guard's response. What had started as a joke had ended with a lesson they would carry with them for a long time. In fact, word of the incident spread quickly. It didn't take long for the footage of the tourists tying James to the pole to go viral. While the prank had been harmless in their eyes, others quickly realized the disrespect it represented. Social media buzzed with mixed reactions. Some people laughed at the tourists' mistake, while others praised the Royal Guards for their professionalism and restraint. James found himself the subject of many online conversations, though he didn't pay much attention to them. What mattered to him wasn't the praise or the attention. It was the responsibility he carried every day. The Royal Guard had to stand firm, not for recognition, but because it was their duty to protect the traditions of the kingdom and show respect to the role they held. Later that evening, Commander Harris called the squad together for a brief meeting. James joined the group, along with the other guards who had responded earlier. Commander Harris stood in front of them, his expression thoughtful but proud. "Well done, everyone," he began. "Today, we showed what it means to stand firm, no matter the circumstances. What happened in the square was unfortunate, but we handled it the way we were trained to. We didn't let it turn into something worse." The guards nodded, their faces serious but proud. They knew the importance of their role and the significance of what they had done that day. Commander Harris continued, "Remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about maintaining dignity and respect for the traditions we represent. The tourists learned their lesson today, and so did we. We never know what challenges we might face, but we face them with strength." James felt a deep sense of pride wash over him. The day had been difficult, but it had reminded him of why he was there, standing as part of the Royal Guard. They weren't just a symbol. They were a living, breathing part of the kingdom's history, and it was their responsibility to protect that history, no matter the challenges they faced. As the meeting ended, James stood for a moment longer, looking out over the quiet square. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he was ready for them. After all, that was what being a Royal Guard was all about, standing tall, no matter what. And as the night settled in, James felt a renewed sense of commitment to his duty. The Royal Guard had shown the city today what they were made of, and James was proud to be a part of it.